Namaskar and welcome viewers. You are with me Surbhi Unyal and I teach philosophy at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. We are doing a special lecture series under the symbolic expressions, and in this series we are doing an introduction to philosophy. Following upon that series, we are doing Mīmāṁsā Philosophy. And we have with us Ms. Manisha, who's going to interpret this lecture in sign language. So in the previous lecture, we discussed what is Mīmāṁsā philosophy, what are the focuses or the objectives in the Mīmāṁsā philosophy. We also talked about, or we were doing, the validity of knowledge. Continuing with that, let us see that how Mīmāṁsakas considered knowledge to be valid. So the Mīmāṁsakas, they uphold the theory of Swatah Pramanyavad, which may be translated as the theory of self-validity or intrinsic validity of knowledge. So all apprehensions is intrinsically valid. That means all knowledge is valid by itself. It is not validated by any other knowledge. So the validity of knowledge arises from those very causes from which the knowledge itself arises. The validity of knowledge arises from the essential nature of the causes of knowledge, and it is not due to any external conditions. So, this means that Mīmāṁsakas, they uphold this theory of Swatah Pramanyavad. Swatah means self-validity of the knowledge, or the intrinsic validity of knowledge. And they believe that any apprehension is intrinsically valid. It does not require any other knowledge to be validated. Why? Because it is valid by itself. And this validity of knowledge, it arises from those very causes from which the knowledge has itself arisen. Since the causes are valid, so the knowledge is valid. So, the validity of knowledge, it basically arises from the essential natures of the causes. And it does not require any external conditions to be valid. So, Prabhakar and the Kumaril Bhatt both uphold the intrinsic validity of knowledge. Prabhakar says that all cognition as cognitions are valid. Their invalidity is due to their disagreements with the real nature of their objects. Kumaril also says that the validity of knowledge consists in its apprehending an object. It is set aside by such discrepancies as its disagreement with the real nature of the objects. So, while for Mīmāṁsakas the invalidity of knowledge is due to the extraneous nature or the conditions, in contrast to the validity of knowledge which is through the intrinsic conditions. So for them, validity of knowledge is intrinsically valid, while the invalidity of knowledge is due to the extraneous conditions or the external conditions. The invalidity of knowledge is due to the extraneous conditions, that is, due to the defect of some of the causes in which the knowledge is produced, or due to some contradiction. But the validity cannot be due to the extraneous conditions. nothing can validate knowledge if the knowledge is not self-validated. So the knowledge has to be, the valid knowledge has to be self-valid. And if it is not self-valid, then nothing in the external world can validate it. So, now with that, let us come to the what are the sources of this valid knowledge. If we are saying that valid knowledge is something which is acquired from the valid conditions and the causes, what are those valid means of cognition? And what are the differences between Prabhakar and Kumaril in accepting those means of cognition? So Prabhakar and Kumaril, they regard knowledge itself as praman or means of knowledge. Gemini admits 3 pramans. Those 3 pramans are perception, inference and testimony. Prabhakar adds 2 more to it, comparison and implication. Kumaril further adds non-apprehension. So, initially Gemini, he admits only 3 pramans: perception, inference and testimony. Later on, Prabhakar, he added 2 more to it. Those are comparison and implication. Kumaril also adds 1 more to it, which is non-apprehension. So both Prabhakar and Kumaril recognizes 2 kinds of knowledge: immediate and mediate. Perception is regarded as immediate knowledge by both, and they admit 2 stages in perception: indeterminate and determinate. Prabhakar defines perception as direct apprehension. Kumaril defines it as direct knowledge produced by the proper contact of the sense organs with the presented objects, which is free from defects. So both Prabhakar and Kumaril, they recognize that knowledge is of 2 types. One is the immediate, the other is the mediate. Talking about the immediate, perception is something which is regarded as an immediate knowledge by both, and they consider that even in perception there are 2 levels or 2 stages, which is determinate and indeterminate. And Prabhakar, he defines this perception as direct apprehension. Kumaril also in a way says that it is a direct apprehension or direct knowledge, but he says that this direct knowledge is produced by the contact of the sense organs with the presented objects. And he also says that it is free from defects. So perception, we know, we have discussed this means of cognition even in our previous lectures. We elaborately discussed it in Nyaya philosophy. So some of the things are quite similar even in the Mīmāṁsikas. So I'm not going into the greater detail, but talking briefly about perception, it is when the sense organs, they come into the contact with the objects. And when these sense organs, they come into the contact with the presented object, that is an immediate knowledge that we get. And this, they are saying that this knowledge, it should be free from any defects. That's why it would be considered as a valid knowledge. But in this also there are various stages. So when we perceive something, the first level is that it is an indeterminate perception. Later on we move on to the determinate perception. So perception is a form of knowledge which results from contact between the object and the sense organs. Generally, we believe whatever is perceived by our senses, it must be true, because in perception, the objects are directly known through our sense organs. And in this, the self comes into the contact with the mind or the manas. The mind comes into the contact with sense organs, and the sense organs come into the contact with the external objects. Thus, perception is an immediate knowledge. So, the process involved in this whole perception is that there is a self, and this self, it comes into the contact with the mind. Mind will come into the contact with the sense organs, and these sense organs are coming into the contact with the objects before them or in the external world, and therefore it is considered to be as an immediate knowledge. So I was stating earlier that like Nyayikas, Mīmāṁsā school has classified perception in various kinds from different perspectives. Firstly, perception is classified into two types: ordinary, which is lokic, and extraordinary, which is alaukic. While sense organs come into the contact with the objects in the usual way, we have ordinary perception, and within this ordinary perception, there are further classifications. So, the savikalpaka, which is the determinate, and nirvikalpaka, which is the indeterminate, are the two forms of ordinary perception. Kinds of perception has been classified into these various perspectives. Firstly, ordinary and extraordinary, and also within the ordinary we have two types, which is the savikalpaka and nirvikalpaka. So the indeterminate perception is awake, it is indefinite and primitive stage of perception. The awareness of the that without its relation to the what, which gains clarity and definiteness afterwards when it becomes determinate. It is the bare awareness which is non-relational and therefore indeterminate. So, looking at the distinction between the savikalpaka and nirvikalpaka perceptions, the indeterminate perception is basically, or the nirvikalpaka perception is basically awake, and it is indefinite and a primitive stage. So, it's a very initial stage when you perceive something and your perception is still vague and it's not definite. So, it is indefinite. Here the awareness of that is without the relation to what. So, you do not really know what it is actually. So, you have not yet have that definite idea of what it is. And it gains clarity slowly when and later on it also gains definiteness when it becomes determinate. So, when it becomes savikalpaka, that's when we gain clarity. So, savikalpaka or determinate perception is basically the definiteness that we get in the perception, while the indefinite one is a bare awareness, and in this bare awareness there is a non-relational aspect. Fine. So, that is the distinction between determinate and indeterminate perception. The second kind of means or the praman used or accepted by Mīmāṁsakas is the inference or anuman. In anuman, there is no such direct presentation of the object, and therefore it is called paroksha gyan or mediate knowledge. In Anuman, an object is inferred to be present in a particular case because it has been invariably perceived to be present in all such similar cases. Thus, in Anuman, the cognition of an object is based on our prior knowledge of it. For example, the very famous example used here, we see smoke in a distant hill. From the presence of the smoke, we at once infer that or there must be fire in the distant hill. So Anuman or inference is you can say mediate knowledge. It's not an immediate knowledge like perception. It's a mediate knowledge where we perceive or where we infer something from what has been perceived earlier. And we try to look at the relation between what is not perceived from what is perceived. So, Anuman is basically based on our prior knowledge and also on the prior cognition. So, it is defined as that cognition which presupposes some other cognition. It is described as a form of cognition that relies on prior cognition. It is indirect and mediated process. And how does it emerge? It emerges through the presence of a mark or a middle term referred to as ling or hetu, which is consistently linked with the major term, and that's how we come to know or we come to infer something by seeing this relation between the middle term and the major term. So the invariable concomitance, which is vyapti, is considered to be the nerve of inference. And vyapti is the invariable association of the middle term with the major term, and that's how the whole process of inference takes place. We are aware of the constant connection between the smoke and the fire, referred to as vyapti. So when we observe smoke on the hill, we deduce that there must be fire on the hill. And in this scenario, the hill becomes the minor term, fire is the major term, and smoke serves as the middle term. And in this way, the whole process of inference takes place, and that's how we gain knowledge. By combining our observation of the smoke on the hill with the understanding that wherever there is smoke, there is fire. So from that, we logically conclude that there is smoke on the hill. And this is what we call inference. Moving now to the third praman, which is comparison. So Mīmāṁsaka view on comparison or upaman differs from the Nyaya view. So according to Nyaya, comparison is the knowledge of the relation between a word and the object denoted by that word. It is the knowledge of similarity of an unknown object like a wild cow with the known object like a cow. The knowledge is like this, which is that the perceived wild cow is like the remembered cow. Now Mīmāṁsakas, they refute this account of comparison stated by the Nyayikas. They point out that the knowledge of the relation between the word and the object denoted by that word is considered to be derived from the verbal authority. For example, by the word of a person who tells that wild cow is similar to the cow. And this is not by comparison, it is by verbal testimony. So it is known through the recollection of what was learned from the verbal knowledge of that person. So the knowledge of wild cow itself is due to the perception and not comparison. Hence, comparison, according to Mīmāṁsā, apprehends the similarity of the remembered cow to the perceived wild cow. And this knowledge is like this, which is that the remembered cow is like the perceived wild cow. And that's how they differentiate between the differentiate from the Nyayikas. So it is the cow as possessing similarity with the wild cow, and that is known by comparison. So a person need not be told by anyone that a wild cow is similar to a cow. Any person who has seen cow and happens to see wild cow himself remembers the cow as similar to the wild cow he is perceiving. And this knowledge is of similarity or comparison. The fourth is verbal testimony. So testimony or Shabd Praman has got the greatest importance in Mīmāṁsakas. Testimony is verbal authority. It is the knowledge of suprasensible objects which is produced by the comprehension of the meaning of words. Kumaral divides testimony into personal, which is Paurusha, and impersonal, which is Aparusha. The former is the testimony of the trustworthy persons, which is the Aptavakya, and the latter is the testimony of the Vedas, which is Vedavakya. This knowledge, they are saying it is valid in itself, it is an intrinsic validity, but the former is not valid in itself. It's the validity, its validity is inferred from the trustworthy character of the person. So only Vedic knowledge is valid by itself. The knowledge which is from the Purusha, which is the person, that is not valid by itself, and the validity here lies on the trustworthy character of the person. It may be vitiated by doubt and error and may be contradicted afterwards. The Vedas, they are eternal and authorless. It is not the work of any person, human or divine. The sages are only the seers. They are not the authors of the Veda. So Veda is not composed or spoken even by the God. So it's authorless and it is eternal. The Vedas, they deals with dharma, and the objects denoted by it cannot be known by perception, inference, comparison, or any other means of valid knowledge. Hence, the Vedic injunctions can never be contradicted by any subsequent knowledge. And there can be no internal contradiction in the Veda itself. Hence, the Vedic testimony is valid in itself. While Prabhakar admits only Vedic testimony as real testimony and reduces human testimony to inference, because its validity is inferred from the trustworthy character of a person. Therefore, according to him, this validity is, or we can say this is reduced to inference, because it would depend on the trustworthy character of the person. So, testimony may give us knowledge of the existent objects or may command us to do something. Kumaral admits the distinction between existential and the injunctive propositions and limits the scope of Vedas to the later, which is the injunctive propositions. the Veda deals with injunctions, and prohibitions are injunctions in disguise. So the Veda commands us to do certain things and to refrain from doing certain things. It deals with the supra-sensible dharma or duty, and if we follow the Vedic commandments, we incur merits, and if we do not, we incur demerits. So action therefore is the final import of the Vedas. The Veda is broadly divided into Vidhivad or injunctions and Arthavad or explanations. The existential or the assertive proposition of the Vedas are merely explanatory passages which explain the injunctions of the Vedas, which are the final import. While Prabhakar takes a strictly pragmatic view of all knowledge, knowledge leads to successful activity. Action is only import of knowledge, and he therefore refuses to accept that knowledge deals with existent things. All propositions must be injunctive. All knowledge, whether Vedic or secular, points to activity. So the so-called assertive or explanatory propositions in Vedas are authoritative only when they help person to perform their duty. And lastly, the testimony is verbal cognition and is derived from the meaning of the words which compose sentences. So to uphold the eternality and the authorlessness of the Vedas, the Mīmāṁsakas put forward the theory that words and meanings as well as their relations are natural and eternal. So with this we'll come to an end of this lecture, and there are some other praman that we would be doing in our next lecture. So that's all for today, and thank you for watching our lecture.